from around the world working for the rights to self-determination. This event jointly with our members, Assemblea Nacional Catalana, that obviously is one of the leading organizations fighting for the rights of the Catalan minority in Spain. Today's side event is done on the side of the UN Minority Forum, which is an annual meeting of minorities with member states of the United Nations to talk about issues affecting minorities. This year's meeting is about hate speech. It's about hate speech online in particular, which is a growing phenomenon that we see all over the world, impacting minorities and indigenous communities more than it impacts almost any other. Minorities and indigenous communities seemingly are scapegoated for just about every ill in society as they arise, and particularly in times of crisis like we have today in the coronavirus pandemic, that scapegoating seems to increase and place minorities and indigenous communities at a greater threat. This year, we just spoke at the Minority Forum, and we highlighted two things. First, we highlighted the fact that we're so concerned about the spread of hate speech against minorities. This is something that is incredibly concerning for us at the UNPO and for all of our members from all over the world. But we also highlighted the difficulty that states are having in implementing proper legislation that would protect people against hate speech. And in particular, the fact that authoritarian states or other states that seem to wish to restrict the speech of certain groups are using hate speech legislation in much the way that 20 years ago states started to use counterterrorism legislation as a means to prosecute free speech that has nothing to do with hate speech, free speech that's political speech. In the lead up to the Minority Forum, the UNPO started working with our really close partners, Aix Global Justice, which is the law clinic at the University of Aix-Marseille in France. And at the beginning of the year, we started talking to our partners there and to our members in the ANC about the issue of hate speech and the overuse of hate speech legislation, as well as the lack of protection of minorities. And we commissioned a study with the university on the question of hate speech in Spain and hate speech as it's directed at the Catalan minority. This event today is to discuss what our findings look like and to discuss this issue on what it looks like in Spain and what recommendations we might have for the Spanish government and for the international community to tackle both the issue of hate speech against the Catalan minority and the overuse of criminal justice legislation targeting the free speech of the Catalan minority. I'm really delighted that we're to be joined today by three just really excellent experts who will give us their perspectives on this work. We will start with Indira Boutier from Aix Global Justice, who I'll introduce in a bit more depth in a minute, who will introduce the work that has been done in the lead up to this important event. We'll then hand over to Elisenda Rovira, who is a journalist from Catalonia, and really an expert on the rise of hate speech in Spain, as well as on efforts to limit the ability of Catalan journalists to function properly in Spain. And then finally, we'll hand over to Elisenda Paluzie, who is the head of the Catalan National Assembly, and has had that position for quite some number of years now, and has herself been subject to the overuse of legislation, criminal justice legislation in Spain. After that, if you're all following on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, I believe it's all on YouTube. If you're sending in any comments, those comments and questions will be fed to me. And at the end, we'll have a time for me to pose those questions to our panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Indira Boutier from Aix Global Justice. Indira is an MPhil student at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London, where she specializes in discriminatory legislation of minorities in South Asia. She's currently a case manager for Aix Global Justice at the same time as doing her PhD, her MPhil. And today she's representing the team within Aix Global Justice that has worked all of this year on hate speech on the Catalan minorities. So over to you, Indira, to present the findings from the work so far.
Well, thank you for this presentation. This report, undertaken during the academic year of 2019-2020 by Aix Global Justice, aimed to study and examine the ways in which the discourse of hate against the Catalan minority has spread in social media and the inadequacy of government response to this phenomenon. We look at the following points. Firstly, international legislation on the question of hate speech. Secondly, European legislation. Thirdly, social media regulation. And we analyze the case of Catalonia in the light of these three elements. We focused on the more recent years, and especially on events following the 2006 vote for a new statute of autonomy. The Spanish Constitutional Court considered this unconstitutional, while severely limiting the power of the statute. The 2006 vote led to a systematic campaign of repression by the Spanish state. In the report, we found troubling increase of hate speech against the Catalan national minority and the violation of international and European law standards by the Spanish state. The use of hate speech in the case of the Catalan minority not only comes from Spain's politicians, but also from mass media and social media such as Twitter. Two main elements have increased hate speech. Firstly, three political parties, the Popular Party, the Socialist Party, and Ciudadanos, after 2006, have built stigmatizing narrative against the Catalan minority and hate speech that spread beyond political debate. Secondly, the brutal repression of 1st October 2017 Catalan referendum for independence and the arbitrary detention and political leaders intensified this situation. So, what was the position of the judiciary on the intensification of hate speech towards the community? We noted that the legal framework is open to authoritarian interpretations accompanied by a conservative judiciary acting as the tool of a state to maintain territorial integrity. In contrast, the punishment of hate crime is not applied with the same rigor when it is directed against Catalans. So application of national legislation on this point does not comply with international standards. In Spain's national laws, Article 510 of the Spanish Criminal Law, which states that encouraging or inciting hate, hostility, discrimination, or violence against a group or a person part of that group shall be punished by a prison sentence. So this article provides elements in alignment with provisions of both Article 20, Paragraph 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Article 3 of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But the regulation of hate speech depends strongly on the Spanish state's proactive action. And we noted that the Spanish state seems at first glance to follow the international legislation with Article 510 of the Spanish Criminal Code. However, this article is not duly exercised. For instance, in the recent case of the Fiesta del Judas in April 2019, the Public Prosecutor's Office held that the act of setting fire to and killing a puppet representing Carles Puigdemont was rooted in the tradition of burning effigies. It did not constitute an expression of hateful feelings or incitement to hatred and violence. While the prosecutor's office respected international standards of judging hate speech by taking into account the traditional context of this event, it failed to take due account of the content and form and likelihood of incitement. These elements have shown that the state's and judiciary's tolerance of anti-Catalonian positions and sentiment appears to have fostered increasing hostility towards Catalans. It has encouraged the spill over hate speech from political discourse into mass media and social media. Public figures use the platform offered by mass media to promote calls for violence. So, police brutality witnessed during the 2017 Catalan referendum was not only endorsed by all Spanish media, but tougher action was demanded against those defending the political agenda for Catalonia. The report shows that media have reproduced political and social power hierarchies in a systematic way. In fact, our main difficulty arose at the beginning of our inquiry. We were confused as the mass media only mentioned the use of hate speech by Catalans towards Spain and not the contrary. So on the subject of Catalonia, the Spanish mass media, rather than pursuing investigative journalism, has instead become a voice of the state. In almost all mass media examined by us, a critical tone can be observed when talking of Catalans. The national press presented a permanently negative image. Instead of critically viewing the systemic repression by the state, media tended to question the role of Catalonia as the victim of this repression. Our research showed that views represented by pro-independence Catalans are missing from the public debate. In short, the Spanish mass media has participated in the construction of a hostile discourse towards the Catalan minority and even promoted it. So in December 2017, Catalans gathered in Brussels to demonstrate in favor of the restoration of autonomy and the release of imprisoned politicians. This event was presented by Spanish newspaper as aggressive and out of control. Comparisons were even made to guerrilla warfare. Politicians find in social media a channel of diffusion to get their message across to millions of users. These users in turn multiply and intensify the terms of hate speech. Whether we are talking about people who are publicly known or anonymous accounts, the stigmatization of the Catalan minority has become a recurring theme. Our report took note of the European Court of Human Rights conclusions in the Altintas versus Turkey case, which was in March 10, 2020, and it recalled that writings might encourage or incite individuals to commit similar violent acts and therefore should be minimized. So our investigation reveals that hate speech against Catalans has been on the increase in social media. There is a clear Catalanophobic elements in contents published in all social media in Spain, especially on Twitter. This can be linked to the Spanish nationalist representation of Catalonia as a threat to national unity and the corresponding rise of the extreme right and the instrumentalization of the Catalan case. So for example, on Twitter, from 24 to 31st May 2020, out of a total of 130,000 conversations about Catalonia, 33% carried negative connotations. And additionally, 7 out of 10 of the most important Spanish influencers on this platform published negative comments on Catalonia. The messages are different in nature and scope, but their underlying ideas is the same. This hatred of Catalonians is expressed by anonymous users, public figures, and even political leaders. Social media is used to call for demonstrations aimed at intensifying animosity towards Catalonia, including illegal acts involving harassment, assault, or trespassing of property. And in its General Recommendation 29, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination recommends state parties to take strict measures against incitements to discrimination or violence through the internet. So both newspaper and social media provide evidence of insensitive promoting hate against Catalans and of harassment. The report found clearly visible consequences of hate speech. First, since the Catalan referendum, there has been a worrying increase in ultra-nationalist violence against Catalan citizens in favor of self-determination. In fact, in the last quarter of 2017, there were 139 violent incidents against Catalans. However, this violence is often unreported and unpunished. Second, Harassment of individuals is common, and it's caused especially by Vox and far-right sympathizers. And this includes digital bullying of minors using Catalan in social media, for instance. Such form of discrimination also impact public officials. There have been cases of fines, threats, refusal to help, and detention by the Spanish police only for speaking their own language. The report compared the Spanish state's compliance with international standards. These maintain that the state is obliged to act effectively to tackle hate speech. The European Court of Human Rights has identified aggressive nationalism and discrimination against minorities as being elements of hate speech. Two famous rulings can be applied to the case of Catalonia. First, the court ruled that speeches that offend, shock, or disturb the state or any sector of the population are considered as hate speech. And that was in Henderson versus UK in 1976. Second, in their speech, politicians should avoid making comments likely to foster such intolerance. And that was in Erbakan versus Turkey in 2006. So considering these two rulings, we reached the conclusion that when it comes to hate speech, European human rights standards are not fully respected by the Spanish state. For instance, in February 2019, the Court of Girona rejected tweets comparing the Catalan independence to Nazism and Third Reich Germany as a hate of crime, on the pretext that the attacks were not collective, thus not qualifying as hate speech because of the absence of incitement to hatred against a specific group. The generalized and multifaceted character of this hate speech has been established. We have shown how this discourse comes from very different sources, ranging from anonymous users in social media to political leaders and public figures with thousands of followers. From a quantitative point of view, these messages have reached millions of individuals. From a qualitative point of view, the Catalanophobic character of this message is clear. The impunity which these messages are delivered has also been demonstrated. Hate speech goes beyond the realm of political rhetoric. Media and social media have real effects on people's representations of others. Catalanophobia is not only found in the network, but it also finds its translation in aggressions and threats towards specific individuals. Despite this, there is widespread impunity in hate speech targeting the Catalan minority, and this shows a violation of international and European law.
Thank you very much, Indira, for that. That was a really excellent coverage of what has been a superb piece of research done by Aix Global Justice. I will have questions for you later, I'm certain. I want to say one thing. You mentioned your surprise when you started looking at this, yes, at the level, the uneven-handed nature in which these things were covered in Spain. I will say one thing that has been shocking to us at the UNPO, which is the uneven nature in which these issues are covered at the European level by the European Union. Mm-hmm. In September of 2020, the EU released a report on rule of law, targeting all of the countries of the EU. And its report on Spain only had 2 mentions of Catalonia, despite all of the statements made by the United Nations, the special procedures of the United Nations, and everything targeting on issues about targeting Catalan people, targeting free speech, unlawful detention of the political prisoners in Spain. All of those issues were left out. And the only thing that was in there was some small reference to some people who were complaining about Spanish national media journalists in Catalonia, but rather not the other way around. So the only mention by the European Union was of Catalonia was that the people in Catalonia are having difficulties dealing with the national media in terms of criticizing the national media, and not vice versa. And I thought your research highlights the lie in that, frankly, the shameful lie, I think, that underlies the EU's rule of law report on Spain. And it brings me to our next speaker, Elisenda Rovira. Elisenda is a Catalan journalist, an editor and coordinator of the Catalan Critical Media Observatory, Mèdia.cat. Her professional background includes working on TV networks, radio and the press, and has also worked in the field of communications of NGOs and institutions. She collaborates with several Catalan media, writing on politics and social transformation, and in her work has gained valuable insight into the rise of the far right in Spain, the rise of hate speech in Spain, as well as the difficulties and challenges that the Catalans have when it comes to speaking themselves, and the overuse of criminal justice in Spain against them. I'm going to hand it over to you, Elisenda, to give us a sense of what it is to be a journalist a Catalan journalist, or even a Catalan person in Spain, as it relates to hate speech and freedom of expression.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for having us today. I would like to just go directly to some examples that I think that speak clearly, because I think that the report that Indira presented states very well, which has like the frame of this hate speech going on and why. But first of all, I'd like to just give like 4 quick ideas on hate speech in the media, or Catalanophobia in the media, we can call it like that. Actually, we do have first of all, we as a media observatory, we focus on the media that broadcasts in the Catalan speaking territories, and this of course includes the Spanish national media that can be seen or watched in Catalonia, Balearic Islands, and the Valencian country. And in this media, we have seen in recent years, related to the Catalan referendum or independence, but also before, very clear signs of what we can call Catalanophobia, maybe. Actually, if we could like see the historical archives, in 1873, even there was these kind of things in the newspaper, so it's not new, and it's not only something related to the dictatorship, as Indira also explained well. I might say that the Spanish state has worked to present itself like a very democratic society after the Franco regime. But the thing is that Catalanophobia in our democracy even is used to perpetuate hegemony by political parties or agents, even the media, because sometimes it's well seen to show this kind of discourse. An important problem related to that is the lack of pluralism, of media pluralism. Of course, Spain is not the worst country in the world in this issue, but if we check some studies, for example, the study of the Center for Pluralism and Freedom in the Media of the European University in May 2017, it stated that political independence is one of the issues at risk in the media landscape in Spain, with a risk of 54 out of 100, and also the independence of the public media. We will go to that later. The concentration of the ownership in the Spanish media is also a factor of risk, because also the gag law, as it has been mentioned before, it is a problem affecting the media. These things are not only worrying, but also dangerous, because they lead to physical violence against journalists, as we will see, but also against general public or pro-independence demonstrators, as Indira also mentioned. So let me just see if I can share my screen and show you some examples, which I should, sorry, because I'm not sure if I can share it now. It worked like 5 minutes before when I tried, but as it always happens, then in real life the problems appear. Let me see if I can do this now. Well, I might. I'm sorry. I tried to share all the screen and let's see if we can do it. Okay. So this, I will play a video from the Spanish public TV.
Era evident que tots sabem que podem acabar a la presó, a presons espanyoles, tots, també nosaltres. Si finalment, per les raons que siguin, es concedeix una extradició, que nosaltres lluitarem fins al final perquè no es produeixi.
Carles Puigdemont comparecía ante el magistrado belga.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you could hear the audio.
Yes, very well.
Okay, so as I said, this was a video from the Spanish public TV, a report in this weekly program of in-depth reports about Carles Puigdemont, the former Catalan president, and the music, if you could hear, that was the Exorcist movie. So I mean, this is not a joke. This is a serious report program, and this music of The Exorcist is not, of course, an innocent choice. It might be like only one case, but it shows a little bit some things that have been going on. One thing that has been worrying us in Mèdia.cat for the last years is how many times we see media criminalization of the Catalan pro-independence movement that is followed some weeks or some months after by judiciary prosecution. There was a very clear case regarding the CDR, the Committees on Defending the Republic, that were like social movements of people organized in towns and neighborhoods, like a pro-independence movement. And there was in this time where we could see very different media, left media and right media, portraying this CDR as terrorists, directly violent, etc., etc. I'm not sure if I have this example here. Yeah, so you might see this. This report from El País talking about violence, but other media also even compared CDR with a movement related to the Basque terrorist movement ETA. So sorry about all this technical stuff. I hope it's not too wing. So we saw that on April 2018, more or less, all this news talking about tension with violence in the pro-independence movement, which was not actually going on, or it was not very factual. And then we saw these detentions a few weeks later of pro-independence activists. And in the coverage of these detentions, the presumption of innocence was not present in the reports. Even we had news programs explaining things that were not public, because we've seen many times that the reports of the public prosecutors are known by some media, before they are made public, so people learn about their own cases or their own accusations for TV before they have the factual information because of the filtrations. So there were people that TV were saying that they were preparing bombs to prepare bombings in the time that the political leaders, the trial to the political leaders, the pro-independence leaders, was about to be ruled, and the media was saying that they were preparing bombs before even the accusations were formally made. We have also seen in the opinion sections of the newspapers, there has been a very worrying process of narrowing the points of view. The main Spanish newspapers, some of them were also very narrowed before all the process of independence, but I must mention again El País, which you may know it is so-called leftist, it used to be the left newspaper in Spain, and there they fired a bunch of opinators that were non-pro-independence but were critical with the way that Spanish state was handling the crisis in Catalonia. For example, John Carlin was fired for an article he published not in El País but in the Times of London, where he criticized, he was highly critical of Madrid's political class and King Felipe for the way they handled the crisis. So he was fired of El País as an opinator. As I said, El País shares its hardline stance on Catalonia with the right-wing Madrid-based other newspapers such as El ABC, La Razón, or El Mundo. This constitutional editorial line seeps into the news coverage, especially in the territorial issue. Also, regarding social media, there would be a ton of examples, but I would like to mention what Indira also explained that is included in the report, this case of some tweets comparing the Catalan pro-independence movement to Nazism, that there were no finally prosecuted because the Girona High Court saw no hate crime in them. The thing is, I was today preparing this presentation and I tried to find these tweets. So I searched on Twitter, Catalans, non-independentist Catalans are the Jews in Catalonia, which is something that these tweets said. And the thing is, you can nowadays find more than 1 and 2 and 3 tweets saying this right now. So this is a proof that the hate speech doesn't stop, because we still have more and more of these tweets saying the same things. I don't want to. I'm short of time, but I wanted to stress one final thing that also was very important in terms of the media role against the Catalan minority. That was a very organized and permanent questioning of the Catalan public media and the work it did, accusing the Catalan public media of being absolutely biased for the pro-independence movement. And of course, we as journalists, and especially as a media observatory, have to be able to criticize and to see what every media does, and there is no perfect media, but the accusations to TV3 and the Catalan public media have been really, let's say, strange. Actually, there was even a request for protection at the European Parliament's Committee on Petitions, presented by 2 European citizens that were really tied and connected to the Popular Party, but they presented themselves as just regular citizens. And the issue of the lack of plurality in the Catalan public media was addressed in this committee. Actually, this petition hide, at least in the Spanish media, that the Spanish public TV workers had brought petitions to the committee, a complaint about the lack of plurality in their own television. So in this discussion, it's very. I hope you can see now. I will try to share my my screen now, because there was a big debate on the lack of plurality on pro-independence debates in the Catalan public TV, accusing the Catalan TV to be not to have enough plurality, because, as you can see here, the number 3 is for TV3, for the Catalan public media. It had 61% of analysts in favor of independence and 38.6 against. Of course, it could be more balanced. It could be 50-50. But if you see all the other televisions that are from Spain, they were really really biased for the people against the pro-independence movement. Even Telecinco, the last one, had no one in favor of the independence among their analysts. So this has been a really issue of debate recently. And also another thing was the violence against journalists in Catalonia, because we have seen many attacks. But the thing is, some of them by the police, but also some of them by demonstrators. There have been people in demonstrations pro-independence and pro-Spain. There have been incidents, but there are differences. The amount of incidents in each part is very different. And also in the pro-Spain demonstrations, there were far-right demonstrators of far-right people that also caused several aggressions to journalists. And this has been unreported in Catalan media and in Spanish media, sorry. So there is also this lack of this way that the far right is not called as it is. So the far right is usually called conservative or other names that don't specify that they're really political views. Well, I'm sorry, I had some more examples, but I think this is not very. The way to share the screen is not working a lot, so maybe I can follow them. Then, if someone has any questions, I can continue later. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, Elisenda. And I think actually when we come back, looking at some of the questions that I have or that have come in, we might have an opportunity to look at those examples again. But thank you very much for that. I will shift now to Elisenda Paluzie to give the viewpoint of both an academic and a leader of an incredibly important movement. Elisenda is a professor of economics, and she's a pro-independence political activist in Spain. Since March 2018, she's been the president of Assemblea, the Catalan National Assembly, which is the biggest Catalan civil society organization that is struggling for the right to self-determination of the Catalan people. Elisenda has served as the dean of the Faculty of Economics at the University of Barcelona, between 2009 and 2017. And she's a member of the Center for Economic Analysis and Social Policy of the ULB. As I'm sure we'll hear from Elisenda also, she has been the subject both of intense online criticism and the overweening power of the Spanish state as it attempts to reduce and limit freedom of speech in Catalonia. Elisenda, I will hand it over to you to share your experience, both of Assemblea, of the people of Catalonia, and of yourself as well.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for organizing this event and allowing us to participate. In fact, there's not much left for me to say after Indira's and Elisenda, but I wanted to remark on Indira's the fact that the importance of this report. I haven't read it yet, but the importance of a report from a French research center in human rights concentrating in this topic. It is not a topic that is new, and she remarked it quite well. In fact, and the use of the word Catalanophobia, I think, is particularly well chosen. Catalanophobia is something that has lasted for centuries. We have experience of what we nowadays call hate speech, for many, many centuries in Spain against the Catalan minority. In fact, as she was talking, I was recalling that an uncle of my grandfather published in 1906 a book entitled Cataluña juzgada por los escritores españoles no catalanes, Catalonia judged by the Spanish writers, non-Catalan Spanish writers. And in fact, in the book, he depicted already the descriptions of the Catalans in a very particular colonialist and even racist tone. So I think it's something that has been here for many centuries, as I said. But now we are since the events of October 2017, we have a rise in this type of speech, and both this type of speech and the bias in treating hate speech by not condemning hate speech against the Catalan minority, tolerating it, being absolutely tolerant with it, and on the other hand, using hate speech as a crime in the penal code, in the criminal law in Spain, against Catalan activists. So some of the examples have already been mentioned by my colleagues here, but I will. Elisenda already talked about what happened with the members of the CDR, which is a non-violent action group. Some of them were detained in 1 year ago and held in prison for 4 months. And the use of the mass media of the term terrorist without having, despite of the lack of evidence in all the cases, was extreme. We have also the case of Tamara Carrasco, this young activist also belonging to one of these groups that was detained with the use of the anti-terrorist law and sent to Madrid for 2 days, and then went back with a confinement before COVID. She was confined in her hometown for more than 1 year. And then finally the case went to a normal court of justice and she was absolved because there was nothing. There was just a message that she sent to her friends calling for blocking a motor road. And this woman was accused of terrorism for 1 year and was held under these special conditions for more than 1 year. The other thing that is happening with hate speech is the fact that many Catalans are accused of hate speech crimes for comments in the social media about the Spanish police brutality against Catalan voters. So if someone in Twitter insults the Spanish police. He is accused of hate speech. We know, and the Article 510 of the Spanish Criminal Code states clearly that the hate speech should be devoted to protect vulnerable groups, minorities, groups particularly touched by ethnic origin. It is clear that the police as an institution, as an authority, does not belong to this type of groups. However, the number of cases concerning hate speech just for criticizing the Spanish police brutality in demonstrations or in the events of the referendum are very numerous. Also, there has been an extension of in the punishment of this hate crime. No, it is not called hate crime, but there's an article in the criminal code that considers also a crime to insult Spain or its autonomous communities. However, there has never been a sentence or a case for offenses against Catalonia, the autonomous community of Catalonia. This type of articles of the criminal code are only used to persecute offenses against the Spanish flag or the Spanish king or the Spanish nation, no? Never to protect the offenses against the Catalans as a national minority or the government of Catalonia or so on. Well, you mentioned my case. I think it is not such a relevant case, but well, it shows a little bit how they tend to limit our freedom of expression. So what happened is that after the demonstrations that happened in Catalonia in protest for the sentence, the verdict condemning our political leaders to more than 100 years of prison in total. I was in the Catalan TV, and they were asking me about what were the consequences of this protest for the reputation of the movement, etc. And I mentioned negative consequences, and I mentioned also as a positive impact, or as an impact, a description of the facts, the fact that that it is true that when there are protests, the conflict is visibilized, is more visible, and it appears more in the international media. Well, after that, I had an accusation by Sociedad Civil Catalana, an umbrella organization for groups against independence in Catalonia, that was funded by members of the far right in its origins. So the Spanish prosecutor opened an investigation against me for hate speech and apología de la violencia, defending violence, just for saying that the protest appeared in the international TV. Well, the case was dismissed after a few months, but it's obvious that that it limits your freedom of expression when you are commenting on what you are analyzing what happens in the Catalan society. So this is not an exception, but it's the norm, no? And it also contrasts with the apparent tolerance of the Spanish system as concerns, for instance, the treatment of pro-Nazi groups. It is one of the most tolerant countries. Even the Nazi, there was a criticism of the pro-Nazi groups was considered also hate speech in one statement by a Spanish, I think, prosecutor 1 year ago. So it is very contrasting, because you could be very restrictive and have a very restrictive view on the public discourse, but this is not the case. Spain generally is considered quite tolerant, but the bias is really a discrimination. There's a complete bias in the use of this figure, this criminal concept of hate speech in Spain. that is conducted, no? And I think it belongs to this. It's one more of the figures that are used in a context of a general campaign of repression against the pro-independence movement. Right? It's not something that is isolated. It belongs to a general context of repression that is systematic and that has an objective is to make the movement be completely on the defense side, completely limited, and being worried about defending from several cases, from accusations, and not concentrating in proactive and in the political objective itself. We have another case. It's not hate speech, but it's. I think it concerns also freedom of expression. We have our we organized a campaign 1.5 years ago of strategic consumption. It was called. It was a campaign that was devoted to promote small firms, co-ops in the energy sector and other sectors, and to avoid consuming in big oligopolies that have been very linked to the Spanish political power. Well, nowadays this campaign has been suppressed by a judge in this case in the business law tribunals, and now it faces also the use of possible sanctions under the antitrust and how is it called in English? The defense of perfect competition laws. So, and we are facing huge sanctions, economic sanctions. So if you were to apply the same rule to any campaign of consumption, for instance, groups that favor the consumption of bio products and non-transgenics, or campaigns such as the BDS in defense of Palestine, all these type of campaigns of citizens that organize themselves to promote a type of consumption would face huge sanctions. And this is not the case. They only targeted our campaign because we are a pro-independence group and because we could be favoring a type of economy that would be more disconnected from the Spanish central power that is strongly linked to some big firms in Spain. And yeah, I think I will leave it here for now, and so we have time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Elisenda. I think while it seems, because it's over, to be something that might not be related, I think you got straight at it. Actually, the fact of being labelled or prosecuted or even investigated for hate speech by just using language that had nothing to do actually with anything that could relate to an individual ethnic group. It shows a little bit about the sort of absurdly uneven-handed application of the law that we're seeing in Spain. And actually we've had some questions coming in, and I have some for myself, and I wanted to ask Indira a question that I think will lead into the other questions that come. And that is, we've heard, I think, from now everybody, some very troubling actions, not just words, but actions that seem clearly designed to incite violence, such as the burning of effigies, language around Nazism, and other language like that has been used. And from what I understood from your presentation, the courts or the prosecutors seem to be trying to draw a distinction between the fact that that language is directed towards one or more Catalans in their sort of individual capacity, just to distinguish that from speech that denigrates an entire group in one way. And I wanted to ask you, what does Spanish and international law say about that? Does Spanish and international or international law care that you are directing your speech against a particular person, or must you always, to be subject to hate speech, must you always be directing your speech directly at an entire group? I was interested to hear about what Spanish and international law might say on that.
Well, about international law, that's quite an interesting question, because there is, about hate speech, there's not really a definition on in international law, but there is a definition on the European level. And actually in 1997, there was a recommendation from the Council of Europe, which said that, and it defines hate speech, and it says that it is an expression which propagates, incites, promotes, or justifies hatred against minority. And that's where the point is important, because it says that, and as the advocacy, promotion, or incitement to denigration, hatred, or defamation of a person or a group of person. So it's not only one person, but it can be, a community, or a group. And what is interesting, I think, about Catalan, and I think not many people are aware of it, at least when I started working on this report, I was not aware of it, is that Catalan is a minority. So it's not just about one person or two person. When you have hate speech towards a minority, you're touching the entire community. So it's, you have to take this into account.
Thank you. And of course, the Spanish government has long resisted signing the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on National Minorities, which would require it to recognize minorities within Spain. But it has long resisted that. It's one of the few states in Europe that is left. But still, I don't think you need to sign that agreement, obviously, to be recognized as a minority. And as you were sort of talking about it, and you were mentioning it as a sort of a violence against a particular person. It could be about just a particular person. I looked at the Spanish legislation and noticed actually that it seems to comply actually with what you've just said, which is that I think Article 510 of Chapter 6 of the Spanish Criminal Code defines hate speech as speech against any individual. It's speech that publicly, directly, or indirectly foments, encourages, or incites hatred, hostility, discrimination, or violence against a group, part of that group, or a particular person on account of his or her membership of that group. So from the sounds of it, Spanish law also seems to accord with that European standard of it being relatively broad and allowing or almost requiring some level of action to combat any speech that might incite violence. That could include indeed speech or actions against a particular person. And that, I think, leads me to the next question that I have, which is, let's say you take the example of the burning of the effigy, and this, I think, I'll give this to Elisenda Rovira. You take the example of a burning of an effigy of a leader, of a Catalan leader. The courts might say, well, it's just him. It's just the one person that they're burning, and so therefore it's not about inciting violence against the Catalan people as a whole. Directly, they might say. But I want us to talk about, even if it is direct, I want to talk about indirectly. To what extent are you seeing, or to what extent is it possible that these sorts of statements or violent actions taken against individuals could lead to, or is leading to, violence against ordinary Catalans. Is that a genuine threat that is coming out of this use of speech against Catalan leadership?
Regarding the burning of this effigy, I think it should be mentioned that the justice didn't see that this was a crime, but on the other hand, there has been prosecution against people who burn pictures of the king, which is like a typical way of protesting against monarchy in Spain, and burning a picture of the king is a crime, so an offense. So this difference. If we go to the spring, summer, and fall of 2017, before the independent referendum on October 1st, there was this climate, how can we say that, this environment, this atmosphere of this hate speech being very present. The burning of this effigy of Puigdemont was one incident, but there were many. For example, most people remembered when all the police that was summoned in Catalonia for the referendum, the Spanish police coming from all the other parts of the Spanish state to Catalonia to prevent the referendum. When they were leaving some towns, I think it was in Andalusia, people were shouting to the police, "A por ellos, go for them." For them meaning the Catalans that were voting. And "a por ellos" is also a sentence that has very negative and maybe violent connotations. So we of course, it would be a matter for a very long study to prove really this how to which extent this hate speech in the media or by politicians, leaded to physical violence. But the thing is that we had physical violence. We had 139 violent actions against pro-independence demonstrators, or people who was for the referendum. This is important because this violence was not only directed to pro-independence people, but also to people who defended the right to vote, which sometimes is intentionally confused, but it's not the same, of course. And this violence that we reported in our yearly publication was absolutely silenced in Spanish mainstream media. It included threats, physical violence, also destroying things. For example, the windows of the houses of people, pro-independence mayors, for example. So it was quite, quite important. And also, most of the events, I have a, let me see if I can show you something, because I have this, we published this, this infographic where you can see that most of the incidents, these are all the incidents in 95 days, 139 incidents. There were, of them, 86 were physical aggressions, and there were 101 victims of physical aggression, and 30 of these cases involved journalists. And you can see that the days where these are the days and the number of incidents. In the 1st of October, it doesn't include the violence by the Spanish police during the referendum, because of course, if it would, the graphic would be very different. But it includes violence by common people, and it's you can see like the peaks are pro-Spain demonstrations, 8th of October, 89 of October, and this is 27th of October, the proclamation of the Catalan Republic as well. So the the violence was a fact, and you can continue that. And the journalists also were a target. As I said, I think the journalists were suffered different kind of pressures, attacks, etc., in all kinds of demonstrations, but especially in pro-Spain demonstrations and far-right demonstrations. And these attacks were absolutely silenced by the mainstream media, whereas in pro-independence demonstrations where there was an incident happening, for example, where there was a Spanish TV reporter trying to report live from the demonstrators. From the demonstration, people sometimes shout very loud so they cannot hear what they are doing. And this was really a big issue in newspapers, in Spanish media. I don't know if I'm being clear on that. The thing is, we as an organization of journalists, of course, think that the work of journalists should be always respected, and people has to work freely. But of course, the incidents didn't get the same echo depending on who caused these incidents. And also, as I have shown before, there were really irresponsible reports on Spanish media, which led to people being very angry with some specific media outlets.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's not about one statement immediately leading to violence, but it's about creating an atmosphere in which, in times of crisis, you could imagine violence arising against the Catalan people, and that is very scary. And actually, it was one of the questions that was asked by one of the viewers here: is whether or not the people think that the lack of prosecution of hate speech against Catalans, whether or not it's intentional, is helping to undermine the Catalans' abilities to seek self-determination. And I was wondering, Elisenda, if that's the case, is it the case that the lack of prosecutions of hate speech, of far-right views that are inciting violence, is limiting the ability of the self-determination movement in Catalonia to effectively engage?
Well, I don't think so, but I think that what it is true is that they have been, and it's something that has been thought and it's organized. They have been trying to create civil unrest in Catalonia, conflicts between pro-independence in people in Catalonia and the people in Catalonia that are pro-union and that are mainly of Spanish origin. So this is something that they want it to happen, and it hasn't happened. It is true that there has been some incidents, but despite the mass hate speech in the media, despite all what happened, people haven't gone to confront its neighbor in Catalonia. So, but they would like that to happen. And that's why they do all of this. And I think that one of the good things is that this didn't happen, and it's not happening, and I don't think it will happen. And then I also wanted to mention something about what you were talking about, the burning of figures. And so the figure of the Spanish king was specifically protected by an article in the criminal code, which is called injurias a la corona, no? Injuries to the kingdom or to the king. But what happened is that several people, activists in Catalonia, were prosecuted on these grounds, and they were condemned to prison. And one of these cases, the Enrique Stern and Jaume Roura's case, arrived to the Strasbourg Human Rights Court of Justice, and they sentenced that couldn't be condemned because it was freedom of speech was prevailing. So since then, it is not a crime. Well, it is still a crime. They haven't eliminated it from the criminal code, but now they are not prosecuting the cases when they happen. In fact, we, as the Catalan National Assembly, in the last Spanish king visit to Catalonia, we did that, and nothing has happened. But that was because of Strasbourg. Otherwise, we would be, and in the criminal code in Spain, in principle, it is only this special protection for the king, not for political leaders, democratically elected leaders. They are not protected, or at least the Catalan democratically elected leaders are not protected.
It certainly seems that way. Thank you, Elisenda. And while it's sad to hear the thoughts that the state wants this to happen, it is good to hear that it isn't, which is good. It's been a really great conversation, and I think I want to just mention a little bit about what's the next steps with all of this work, and give a quick summary of, I think, where we're going. Well, one thing, I think the UNPO, working with our partners, working with our member Assemblea and others, I think we have become increasingly concerned that there is a crisis of rule of law in Spain. And what do I mean by that? A crisis in which the law is not being evenly applied on racial grounds, on ethnic grounds. Hate speech and hate crimes legislation is one of the tools that societies use to combat discrimination. At heart, they are there to create equality and inclusive societies. But one of the things that we have to recognize is that while it might be a tool of anti-discrimination, it itself must be used in a non-discriminatory fashion. And what we've heard today indicates that the hate speech legislation in Spain is not being used in a non-discriminatory fashion, in an equal fashion. It is clearly being used in a fashion that is directed towards certain groups and not being directed towards other groups. The Catalan people are bearing the brunt there, but I suspect that there may be others in Spain who have that same experience. What I think the next steps are. Some have asked, what's about the research? When can that be available? We've still got some work to do, because we wanted to take what we've learned today, what we're learning at the Minority Forum, and to include this into the work, so that we can publish something that is really solid, that highlights this issue as one of another example of a crisis of rule of law in Spain. Our intention is to use that for two purposes. One, to highlight that there is a crisis of rule of law in the European Union, and it exists because of the European Union's unwillingness to deal with the crisis of rule of law in Spain. And that when the European Union is professing concern for the rule of law and making, very strong, and I think in many cases very accurate statements against states in Eastern Europe of the European Union, it needs to act itself even-handedly and look at the crisis of rule of law that we're seeing in Western Europe, and in particular in Spain. So we want to use that report to try and make that point, alongside many other much other work that we've been doing on that, such as the overuse of detention legislation in Spain and all of those different things. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that we want to take this report and this work to the United Nations. We want to get increased, more conversations being held by UN experts, by UN agencies, on freedom of speech and expression in Spain, on hate speech and violence directed towards minorities in Spain. And what that means for us is both looking at it from the context of the Catalans themselves, and also trying to think about the issues as it relates to other minorities in Spain, and the extent to which this is an endemic problem that's existed in Spain for a long time and hasn't been tackled, and is directed both at Catalans and at other groups. So we've got a fairly solid and sort of detailed plan of action that we want to do on this over the coming years. We think there's a long way to go. Unfortunately, particularly because the European Union is shielding the Spanish government from the kind of criticism that it should be getting, we believe that there is a very, very long way to go. But that doesn't mean that we should stop and not work on it. I think, as you heard today from all of our wonderful speakers, the issue is real. It is very dangerous, and it gives us fear of what might happen in a time of crisis, in terms of people in Spain directing hatred away from leaders of the Catalan people and towards the ordinary Catalan people, as well as a society that's increasingly moving towards restrictions on freedom of expression and other types of civil liberties. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank in particular Aix Global Justice for all of the work that they've done in this. It has been really wonderful to work with you all on it. I hope everybody who was viewing got something out of this. We are working on this issue quite consistently, and you can find that on our website of the UNPO as well as the website of Assemblea. So please keep your eye open on all of that as we move forward. Thank you very much, and good night to you all.
Thank you.